The most ruthless part of this movie isn't that a baby is being hunted by an entire army. It's that everyone knows he shouldn't die, yet only a few dare to risk their lives to save him. A man, desperate to save his wife and child, revealed the direction of the prince's escape. Is he a traitor, or just a father pushed to the edge? If it were you, caught between the future of a nation and the lives of your wife and child, would you hold your tongue? Or would you fall to your knees and beg the enemy to spare your family? Even more cruel is the fact that he soon realizes that whether he spoke or not, it was already too late. Around 1204, Norway was far from a unified country. The throne here wasn't claimed through peaceful succession, but through blades, snow, blood, and whoever could stay alive until the end. The Birkebeinerne supported King Håkon, while the Baglers were backed by Denmark and the Church, tearing Norway in two. On the surface, they fought for royal power. In reality, they were fighting over who would control the nation's future. And in a place no one noticed, a woman was fleeing with an infant. Her name was Inga from Vartig. The child in her arms was named Håkon Håkonsson, the illegitimate son of King Håkon and the true heir to the throne. The child couldn't even speak yet, nor did he know who he was. But from the moment he was born, his life no longer belonged to him. As long as he lived, the Birkebeinerne had a banner to rally behind, and the Norwegian monarchy still had a bloodline. If he died, the Baglers could plunge the entire country into the shadows of the Church and Denmark. The two Birkebeinerne warriors escorting Inga and the child were Thorstein and Scarvald. Thorstein, as always, valued duty more than his own life. But Scarvald was different. He was tired. He had fought too many battles and seen too many people die. He just wanted to go home to his wife, Yiva, and his son, Eirik. He returned home and promised his wife this was his last mission, and from then on, he would live only for her and their child. But the most brutal thing about a time of chaos is this. Wanting to quit doesn't mean the war will let you go. Meanwhile, at the Nidaros Palace, the real blade was already held against the king. Earl Gisli approached Queen Margareta, demanding she poison King Håkon herself, because only she could get close to the king. Only she could do it without immediate suspicion. Margareta hesitated, saying Håkon was her stepson, but Gisli reminded her he wasn't just a stepson, he was the king. In Gisla's eyes, the young King Håkon no longer understood the situation. The era of the Birkebeinerne had to end. The Baglers would win, the Church would take its place, and he intended to use this war to become the new power. Even more terrifying, her daughter Christina overheard everything. A child had stumbled upon an adult's murder. She didn't understand power, but she knew that if this got out, both she and her mother would die. Margareta held her daughter, making her swear she hadn't heard a thing. She still harbored fantasies that she would remain queen and Christina would be a princess. Soon, the poisoned wine was brought to King Håkon.
Skål, min vän.
For all din kärlek. Skål.
The king drank it without a moment's suspicion.
Farväl, min son.
Before he died, the king summoned Inga Bardsson and finally revealed his last secret.
Inga Bardsson! Birkebeinerne på Østlandet fører han nordover. Møte med her I Østerdalen.
The king died. The palace gates were locked. Inga Bardsson stepped forward and declared that there was a traitor in the palace. Margareta poisoned the king, but she wasn't the only one. She was just a pawn. The person playing the real game was still hidden within the palace walls. But the problem was that all suspicion quickly turned toward Inga himself. Because if the prince died and the Sverre bloodline was severed, one of the most eligible candidates for the throne would be Inga. People began to wonder if he was using the king's death to seize the crown for himself. But Inga knew that Håkon Håkonsson had to live. This baby wasn't just a child, he was the last remaining proof that Norway hadn't been completely swallowed whole. While the palace was in chaos, the real traitor had already sent the message out. In the Bagler camp, a messenger brought Gisla's secret letter. King Håkon was dead, and the Birkebeinerne had lost their anchor. But there was one remaining problem. The king had left behind a son. The Bagler leader understood perfectly. Today, the child was just an innocent baby. Tomorrow, he would be their most dangerous enemy. So he gave the order to his men. Whoever found the child would live the rest of their lives in luxury. Show no mercy, show no hesitation, and bring back the child's head. And so, the first blade struck at Scarvald's home. The Baglers stormed the timber yard, seizing Yiva and Eirik.
Der findes en dreng med kongeligt blod. Hvor er drengen gemt?
Scarvald denied knowing, but the enemy knew he and Thorstein had been part of the escort. They threatened him with his wife and child.
For det overstået.
In this moment, Scarvald was no longer a warrior, a Birkebeiner, or a legendary hero. He was just a father, a husband. Country, crown, and bloodline all felt distant in the face of his family's cries. He broke.
Kom så nær i borg. Han var i borg. Du og Torstein førte ham bort. Jeg så dere.
But once they heard it, the Baglers just sneered. They never intended to spare his family. Yiva didn't say a word until the end. No matter what torture she endured, she never betrayed anyone. Scarvald thought his submission would save them, but all he returned to was the truth that his wife and infant son had been murdered. In that moment, something inside him shattered completely. He broke free and fled wildly into the snow. Behind him were the hunters. Inside him were the corpses of his wife and child. He wasn't running to survive. He was running to deliver a warning and to find redemption. At this time, the prince was hidden in Erlend's timber yard. Thorstein, Inga, and the other Birkebeiners believed they were safe for the moment. Little Håkon was being held, fed, while a young boy nearby practiced with a weapon. There was even a brief moment of warmth in the yard, as if the war had never touched this place. But Scarvald burst in, shattering everyone's illusion of safety. He said the Baglers were coming. The child had to leave immediately. The Birkebeiners in the yard didn't trust him, because he admitted he had given up their direction. Once the news was out, every blade was turned toward him. Some insisted he was a traitor who needed to be executed on the spot, even forcing Thorstein to do it himself to prove his loyalty to the king.
Brødre! Vår ett og vårt blod har i alle tider blitt møtt med motstand. Skulder mot skulder har vi kjempet og bløtt for hverandre. En av oss. Det har alltid vært. Vis at du har tronet kongen.
Thorstein looked at his old friend, torn by indecision. By the code, Scarvald deserved to die. By the heart, he didn't. By the immediate situation, they had no time for a trial. In the very moment of their infighting, the Baglers arrived. The scene was deeply ironic. The Birkebeiners were still arguing over who the traitor was, while the real enemy smashed through the gates. Blades carved through the crowd, fire swallowed the yard, and everyone scattered in flight. Thorstein stopped hesitating. He and Scarvald charged out with the child. Inga wanted to follow her son but was forced to separate. Thorstein could only promise her that they would take care of Håkon. From this moment on, it was no longer an escort mission. It was two men, carrying a nation on their backs, running for their lives through the mountains. They crossed the woods, shaking off their pursuers. But ahead lay no safety, only an even greater blizzard. The cold wind cut like a knife, and the snow swallowed the path. Little Håkon began to cry, his body growing colder, and even Thorstein feared he wouldn't make it. They found a shack and hid inside to escape the storm. No food, no stove, only the warmth of their own bodies. Scarvald held the child while Thorstein told him stories. He turned a common pony into a royal steed, saying it had to cross a volcano to find the fire in its heart. This wasn't a fairy tale to soothe a child. It was the story of their own lives. They were only ordinary men, a farmer who wanted to go home, and a warrior who refused to lay down his duty. Yet fate had placed the heaviest burden upon them, forcing them to walk through this fire in the middle of a frozen hell. In the blizzard, Scarvald could no longer suppress his hatred. He wanted to leave, to strike back when the enemy least expected it. Thorstein angrily stopped him. The future of Norway was in that child, and the only reason they were there was because Scarvald had revealed the direction. The words pierced Scarvald like a blade. He broke down, saying that Yiva had never said a word. She had been so strong, holding out until the very end. And what about him? He had tried to save them, only to destroy everything with his own hands. Thorstein didn't press him further. He handed the token that proved Håkon's identity to Scarvald. In that moment, he wasn't just handing over an object. He was placing the future of the nation into the hands of a man who had faltered, who had sinned, and who was now fighting to redeem himself. They both knew they might not live to the end. But for those who die, what remains is not a corpse, but the choices that those who come after will always remember. Meanwhile, the conspiracy within the Nidaros palace had reached its breaking point. Gisla held Inga captive. He admitted it himself.
Jeg vet at det ikke var du som drepte kongen. For det var det jeg som gjorde.
He wanted the line of King Sverre to end right there. Inga finally realized he had suspected the wrong person. The real snake had been right beside him all along. Inga wanted Gisla to turn back and save the king's son. But Gisla had no desire to be a man validated by his brother. He wanted the throne, the power, and to make everyone kneel before him. And so, he announced to the public, Håkon Håkonsson was dead, lost in the mountain blizzard. Once that lie was told, his path was paved. The king was dead, the prince was dead, and the throne was empty. Gisla feigned humility in accepting the responsibilities of the new king, and even announced he would marry King Sverre's daughter, Christina. As long as the wedding was completed, he could cloak his stolen power in a veneer of legitimacy. But the real Håkon was still on the snowy mountain. After the blizzard ceased, the pursuers closed in again. Thorstein and Scarvald continued to ski, fleeing with the child. The Baglers hunted them relentlessly. Arrows flew from behind. And although Thorstein was struck and wounded, he refused to stop. They finally reached Udin's timber yard, where Inga had also been waiting for her child. The moment the mother held her infant, everyone breathed a sigh of relief. But before they could even catch their breath, the new problem crushed down on them. They had to get Håkon to Nidaros. With only 2 wounded soldiers and a few commoners, they couldn't possibly hold off the Bagler army. Thorstein was treated, the arrow pulled from his body. The people in the yard scrambled in confusion, some grabbing fish oil, some praying, others joking that they had done this sort of thing on reindeer before. The scene seemed light-hearted, but it made the reality even more painful. Because these people weren't soldiers, nor were they a band of heroes. They were just ordinary people, suddenly pushed to the front lines of history. Audun wanted to call for men, but those who came weren't warriors either. They were farmers, hunters, laborers, and some who didn't even know they were going to war. Thorstein panicked when he saw them. How could people like this stop the Baglers? Then Scarvald stood up. He didn't use any flowery language.
Hei! Jeg er ikke Birkebeiner!
Kongen i Nidaros er død. Men Norge har en ny konge. Og han er her. I dag. Dette er Norges nye konge. Håkon Håkonsson. Da han baglerne kommer for å drepe. Hjelp meg å stoppe baglerne en gang for alle, så vi kan samle oss under denne kongen. Og sende disse baglejævlene tilbake til helvete. Hjelp meg. Hjelp oss. Ikke som bønder, men som denne kongens menn. Ekte Birkebeinere.
Vår nye konge.
In that moment, the farmers didn't fight out of loyalty. They fought because they finally realized that if the child died, there would be no survival left for them either. And so, a group of ordinary people stood together as the new Birkebeiners. They made a plan. There was only one road through the valley. Inga and Håkon would go first. Thorstein would lure the Baglers deep inside, and archers would lie in wait on the heights, striking only when the enemy entered range. The plan wasn't complex, but it was their only chance. The Bagler army pressed in from the south. Horse hooves shattered the snow, and armor clattered in the cold. Inga sat on the sled with Håkon, and Egil followed. She soothed the child over and over. But she knew better than anyone that if the rear defense line was breached, she and her child wouldn't stand a chance. The ambush began. The Baglers entered the valley, and arrows rained down from both sides. The farmers and Birkebeiners charged out together. Cries of battle, the neighing of horses, and men falling in the snow turned this valley into a small Ragnarok. But the Baglers broke the defense line, and cavalry continued the pursuit of Inga and Håkon.
Heng på, vi drar!
The most dangerous moment arrived. The sled raced ahead, the pursuers closing in behind. Eagle drove with everything he had, and Inga held the child, her pleas for mercy sounding futile. She looked at the approaching enemy and could only scream. At the critical moment, Scarvald caught up and blocked the path between the pursuers and Inga and Håkon. He fought to the death, finally buying them the time they needed. The man who had once revealed the path to save his family finally used his own body to block the path for the prince. He collapsed in the snow. Thorstein reached his side. Scarvald looked at him as if he had finally shed all his sins. He had completed the mission, and he had completed his redemption. Thorstein had once said they would all die, but what they left behind would continue to live. Now, those words fell upon Scarvald, becoming his final resting place. Elsewhere, the wedding in Nidaros reached its final hour. Gisla prepared to force Christina into marriage, binding the crown, the bloodline, and his lies all into one. Christina was terrified, yet forced not to show it. Outside, people had already begun to revolt, and the Birkebeiners surrounded the Nidaros cathedral. Gisla simply moved the wedding into the palace, closing the doors to complete his usurping ceremony. He thought everything was under his control. But just as the ceremony was underway, Inga arrived with Håkon. She stormed in, telling everyone that this child was Håkon Håkonsson, the legitimate king of Norway. She swore on the child's life to prove his identity. Gisla's lies were shattered by a living infant. Ing finally stepped forward. He knew who the child was, and he knew what the country needed. He acknowledged Håkon Håkonsson's legitimacy and appointed Thorstein as the guardian of the prince. Until Håkon came of age, Inga would protect the throne, and Thorstein would protect the boy. The escape finally came to an end. But it didn't end because one blade defeated another, or because one conspiracy was outplayed by another. It ended because, in the coldest mountains, there were those who refused to let go. In the filthiest game of power, there were those who still believed an infant could represent the future. And when everyone else wanted to save their own skin, there were those who chose to give their lives for others. In 1217, 13-year-old Håkon Håkonsson took the throne from Inga Bardsson. He would go on to rule Norway for 46 years. The child who once wept in the snow, the child who had been carried through a blizzard, ultimately brought peace to a country torn by scars. So, looking back, the people who truly changed history weren't necessarily just the kings. They were also the fathers pushed to the edge, who sinned yet fought for redemption. They were the warriors who knew they would die, yet still carried the child into the storm. They were the mothers who charged into the palace with their babes in arms. And they were the farmers who picked up their bows. They didn't just save a child. They saved the fire of a nation that had not yet gone out. If you were Scarvald, would you forgive the version of yourself that broke in front of your wife and child? If you were Thorstein, would you kill the traitor? Or would you bring him along for the journey? Some movies hurt the most because they don't let you stand in a place of safety to judge others. They push you right into the snow, forcing you to make a choice.